Thank you, and good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. My name is Gabriel Carlsen, Senior Director for FinTech and Digitalization at ICMA, and it's my pleasure to welcome you today to today's webinar on the bond data taxonomy and the latest release of version 2.0. It's great to see participants from across the globe. Registration showed that we had 40 different jurisdictions represented. I'm joined today by Emma Thomas, Associate Director in our team, who looks after ICMA's Bond Data Taxonomy Working Group and AI in Capital Markets Working Group, amongst other responsibilities, as well as Tom Healy, a software engineer and consultant, who has been working with ICMA since the early beginnings of the Bond Data Taxonomy. The release of BDT 2.0 represents the most comprehensive update to the BDT since its inception in 2023. It comes at a time of increasing market adoption across the global fixed income ecosystem, not only for traditional debt securities, but also DLT-based or digital bonds. Digitalization is reshaping every stage of the value chain in international debt capital markets, from issuance, trading, to settlement and distribution, and the BDT is a fundamental building block. This is driven by latest technological advancements, such as generative AI, new funding and revenue models enabled by tokenization and distributed ledger technology, but also regulatory initiatives to modernize and deepen capital markets, further post-trade harmonization, as well as cost pressure and competitive dynamics. So in today's webinar, we will cover three key points. What is the bond data taxonomy, which Emma Thomas will introduce? I will then talk about the why and who's adopted the BDT to date. And Tom Healy will then walk us through the BDT materials and explain different ways to implement the BDT. This will then be followed by a Q&A session. And as a reminder, you can ask questions through the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen. With this, I'm now pleased to hand over to Emma.
Thank you, Gabriel, and welcome everyone. So we're going to start today's session with an introduction to the BDT for those of you who this might be your first time coming across the BDT in a very brief way. So at its core, the BDT is a machine-readable language for the communication of bond data, and this is for all different parties within the bond market. That is from issuers through to banks, investors, market infrastructures, vendor players, and more. And you can see all of the different market players that are involved in the development and utilization of the BDT in this graphic on the screen now. So by providing that standardized structure for the communication of bond data, the BDT is really intending to foster interoperability in the market, especially between these key market players, and facilitate the distribution of bond information, either through sending or receiving those key bond details. And through this, it aims to enable more efficiency in the bond market, more straight-through processing, and also support the adoption of new technologies such as both traditional finance, AI, and DLT-based bonds. So the BDT was first published in 2023, but before then, as Gabriel touched on, the digital transformation of debt capital markets was beginning to take off, and there was increasing pressure and motivation on market players to interpret and distribute those increasing volumes of data that were coming in through the increased number of market players and increased amount of technology influence in the bond market. Oftentimes, this data was unstructured or inconsistent, and so formed the idea to create a machine-readable data standard to help address this problem and support interoperable bond markets. So like I say, in 2023, the first version of the BDT was published, and this at its core was just the key aspects of a plain vanilla bond. So it was limited in scope to the most essential fields for your most typical straightforward bond transaction. Now in 2024, in line with increasing market adoption of DLT-based securities, we added the DLT extension to the BDT, which included a number of fields that related to the important information that was relevant to issuing and transacting a DLT-based bond, and that was in version 1.2. Now, throughout this process, from the release of version 1.2, the release of version 1.2 as well, sorry, 1 to 1.2. The BDT working group, which ICMA convenes and I am the secretariat to, was a key provider of input, feedback, and guidance throughout this whole process. And the BDT working group is open to all ICMA members and contains representatives from all those sectors of the market that I touched upon earlier. So issuers, banks, market infrastructure providers, law firms, and more. And so really, without their guidance and with their guidance, the BDT then reached where it is today. Through 2024, however, and into 2026, ICMA was pleased to see a big uptake in the number of adoption announcements of the BDT and an increase in the amount of BDT integration across the market. Including with this, we launched the integration into ISO 2022 in collaboration with Swift. And with that, the need for further expansion of the BDT grew again. So finally, in April 2026, we released version 2.0 of the BDT. And this expanded on that original concept of the BDT of just a plain vanilla bond to include over 300 fields. So now the BDT machine readable language really accounts for far more workflows and addresses in a far more extensive way the increasing need for high quality data and structured data, and really in light of those growing technological capabilities. Now, as discussed, when we talk about a machine readable format, it can be sometimes misleading as to what that really means. The BDT is available on the ICMA website in XML. So in this diagram here, you can see how the key information for a bond issuance, for example, from a bond term sheet, is taken and then structured into this machine readable XML format. We will go into more detail with 2.0 later on in this webinar on how the XSD structures and XML examples work when it comes to the BDT. But this is really important for when we discuss the transmission of information of the BDT between parties that are either sending or receiving that data. And ultimately, this data can be used for a variety of different purposes within the bond workflow. And for example, that can start with the issuance process through deal announcement, all the way through to registration and settlement, where that golden source of trade data is essential throughout the whole cycle. So if you do have further questions with the BDT, we newly developed an FAQs document, which is now available on the ICMA BDT website to provide further information and address the common questions that we get on the bond data taxonomy. And an example of the questions that we've addressed in this FAQs document are listed here. For example, we often get questions on what training and support is available for those looking to adopt and implement the BDT. And ICMA is always on hand to support and provide guidance throughout implementation processes. But there's also a number of other resources which are listed in this FAQs document as well. And I would encourage all of those who are embarking on BDT adoption or are interested on learning more, or would like to distribute some material within their teams on what the BDT is and what it really intends to do, to reference this document and share it internally. It highlights also, in addition to the basics of the BDT, some of the new features of 2.0 as well. And with that, we really now need to get into the detail of how we reached the version of BDT 2.0. So I will hand back to Gabriel for the next section of this webinar.
Thanks, Emma. So we will now look at what's driving adoption of the bond data taxonomy and who's implemented the BDT to date. And there isn't a single driver, but rather a convergence of factors that are transforming both workflows in bond markets and the nature of products themselves, in particular with the rise of tokenized assets. So we see increasing transaction volumes, notably in the Eurobond market, but also in other market segments. And as a result, a need to automate workflows, further reduce manual processes, and modernize market infrastructure. The rise of DLT and blockchain across asset classes and launch of tokenized products including digital bonds, is reflected in a number of regulatory initiatives and frameworks. These may have different objectives, driven by different policy agendas, but a common denominator is scaling and the necessity for common standards. At the same time, harmonization, notably to address remaining barriers to post-trade in the EU, has been a long-standing objective. The importance of this has gained renewed momentum in light of geopolitics, international competitiveness, and the EU's simplification agenda. And while some barriers are deeply rooted in national frameworks, for example, tax and insolvency law, the importance of standards and interoperability is a cross-cutting theme. Now, this is equally reflected in the legislative agenda, for example, in the European Commission's Market Integration and Supervision Package, known as MISP, which contains provisions on interoperability and standards specifically. But in addition, or in parallel, the vendor landscape in bond markets continues to evolve, in particular when it comes to debt issuance. And when we looked at this a few years back, we observed a proliferation of different solutions. But in the last 12 to 18 months, there's been a clear trend towards consolidation, and also a shift in mindset from a winner-take-all expectation to recognizing that there isn't a single solution for the entire issuance process and bond life cycle, but that different providers will coexist and that interoperability is a practical necessity. A comprehensive list of platforms and services providers across debt issuance, electronic trading, repo trading, and operations can be found in our fintech directories. So if I were to summarize the slide, I would say change is really the only constant on different fronts. So moving on to the next question, who's adopted the bond data taxonomy? To date, the BDT has been adopted by a range of different market stakeholders, both for conventional debt securities as well as for DLT-based or digital bonds. Now, when we first look at digital bonds, for the avoidance of doubt, what we mean here by digital bonds is a bond issued using distributed ledger technology, or DLT. And the government of Hong Kong was the first SSA issuer to adopt the BDT in its digital bond issuance of February 2024, which was a multi-currency issuance in different tranches. This was also first for green bond. It was then followed by Hong Kong's issuance in November 2025, a syndicated multi-currency issuance with a total volume of around $1.2 billion equivalent, which is the largest digital bond issuance to date, so over $1.2 billion equivalent. The transaction also featured settlement in wholesale CBDC for 2 tranches. We have recorded 2 webinars together with the Hong Kong Monetary Authority, which can be found on our website. Then Société Générale Forge integrated the BDT into their digital assets framework, known as CAST framework, early on in 2024. And the BDT also forms a centerpiece of the Guardian Fixed Income Framework under Project Guardian, which was published in 2024. Project Guardian is a global collaborative initiative convened by the Monetary Authority of Singapore, which brings together policymakers and the financial industry with the aim to enhance liquidity and efficiency of financial markets through asset tokenization standards. Now, looking at further use cases and transactions in particular, one that is worth highlighting here is one by DZ Bank, who published a smart bond contract white paper in May 2025, and essentially provides a framework for DLT-based issuances of debt securities end-to-end in conjunction with the BDT. Then earlier this year, DZ Bank and KfW completed a pilot transaction using the BDT. The approach here is to use the bond data taxonomy as a basis, create smart contracts, and automate the entire lifecycle. Then at Cybers last year, SWIFT launched a digital asset standards platform, POC, for the creation of tokenized securities based on the bond data taxonomy in ISO 20022 format. The platform that was launched follows a modular approach, supporting the deployment of tokenized assets across multiple DLT or blockchain networks. So when we look at the 2 sides here of DLT-based capital markets and conventional, the key point really is that a bond remains a bond irrespective of the underlying infrastructure. That said, the BDT also caters to DLT-specific features, and we will delve in a bit more detail on this. Now, in parallel, the BDT has also been adopted to digitize workflows of traditional debt securities. Early on, the software provider Investor integrated the BDT, and in August last year, the World Bank Treasury implemented the bond data taxonomy in two AI projects called Astra and Shastra, which are designed for issuers and investors and to leverage the latest technological advancements in AI. So the overarching aim was to streamline operations, prevent settlement fails, and enhance security management. And a key component here is to create a single trusted source of validated trade data based on the BDT. It's a very interesting approach, and there's a joint webinar with the World Bank Treasury that we did in November last year, and which is available on our website. Now, moving on, looking at September last year, Euroclear and Clearstream issued a joint statement announcing their intention to digitize the Eurobond market in alignment with the BDT. And there's different aspects in this announcement. One is the issuance of Eurobonds in dematerialized form, eliminating the need for paper certificates and enabling automation and the adoption of new technologies across the entire Eurobond lifecycle. But the other is about data standards and the ICSD's efforts to reduce fragmentation in alignment with the BDT. And this initiative has gone live in the meantime. Also in September, the European Central Bank's AMISECO, the advisory group on market infrastructures for securities and collateral, published a report on remaining barriers to integration in securities post-trade services. The wider context here is the integration of EU capital markets. This report includes a number of recommendations to address existing obstacles such as fundamental legal barriers, barriers in the buyer-to-seller relationship, and others. And it features specific recommendations for stakeholders in the value chain of bond markets and more broadly to adopt existing market standards such as the bond data taxonomy as a common language, in particular when it comes to the electronic exchange of bond data. Then, the same in November last year, Covalent Capital, based in Asia Pacific, implemented the BDT for their liability management and money market solution, LIMO. And then in May this year, shortly after the release of BDT 2.0, Origin Markets announced that they now supported the BDT in their software for the automation of issuance documentation. Then, coming back to ISO 20022, in parallel, and as already alluded to, we have been working with Swift since early 2025 to integrate the BDT into ISO 20022. Tom will provide a bit more color on this initiative. And there are other implementations that are underway. These announcements here can also be found on the BDT website. But it's important to highlight that version 2.0 reflects extensive engagement with a broad range of industry stakeholders in the last 12 to 18 months. And I would like to take the opportunity here to thank our members and market stakeholders for their constructive collaboration and feedback, which has been invaluable for the release of this latest version. Now we will look at the different ways to implement the BDT and the different components that make up version 2.0. Tom, over to you.
Great. Thanks, Gabriel. So as it's been said, the BDT is an open and extensible standard that supports the life cycle of issuance in traditional and DLT environments and has been proven as such. The BDT can be implemented to standardize communication between issuers, managers, service providers, from origination to closing. The BDT can also be used as reference data for order processing, trading, and corporate actions after issuance. Because the BDT is an open XML standard, it is technology agnostic and thus supports a wide range of implementation options and use cases. Where available, the BDT also uses other ISO standards and other industry standards as well, and will also be available in JSON format in addition to XML. The BDT is also an important standard for AI projects by establishing a definitive reference for consistent deterministic rule generation that is supported by a governance process. Platforms can integrate the BDT to parse issuer documents into standardized data models and share XML files and integrate into AI-generated workflows. So To get the BDT data pack, it's available on the ICMA BDT webpage on the resources tab. You'll find there a BDT PowerPoint overview, the XSD files, 3 XSD files that form the specification of the BDT and what's needed to generate XML files, generate and read XML files, the user guide, a multiple XML examples, as I'm going to show you in a minute, and then the Excel reference sheet. So just go ahead and register, download the zip file, and then you can get all of the contents of the BDT. So just covering a couple of the documents that are in there, there is an Excel reference sheet. The Excel reference sheet is one tool that you can use to see the structure and data elements of the BDT. It is a complete download of the XSD data into an Excel format that is grouped together. And you'll see here the actual structure of the BDT, which is composed of the document information, party and party role information, issuance, product, and then the series, tranche, and class. Within each group, you can expand this to actually see the data elements as well as examples of what data would go into each field, and the data type and the number of cardinality, I'd say, of the fields themselves. There is also a tab on the sheet that will show you all the enumerations or the fixed codes, if you would, that have been built into the BDT that help standardize the data. And then there is a tab here which describes all the changes from version 1.2 to version 2.0. So BDT 2.0, as mentioned, has a significant expansion over 1.2. There are now some 300 or more fields and covers the full issuance process and a wide range of issuance types. There are more than 200 enhancements and changes from 1.2 into 2.0. While the overall structure of the BDT remains very similar, there has been a considerable expansion in certain areas. I'm just going to touch upon a couple of those so you get an idea what the overall structure is and a couple of examples here as well. So starting at the top, this was really meant to help with a workflow management. There's a document information section here, which identifies the version of the XML document that you are creating, as well as the version of the BDT that you're using. BDT 1.2 is still available if you, as a smaller data pack, if you want to use that. But this document information includes information about the version, contact information, and a custom disclaimer that each firm can include on their own. The party structure, this area here, the party group, this was restructured to align with ISO 20022. So party roles are now built into or included within the party as opposed to using a more complicated link structure. So you can see the party roles here now under each party. And we've also expanded the number of parties as well, while still trying to keep a minimal standardized set so that there's consistency across the market. Also mention that all amounts that previously were decimal amounts have now been converted into amounts that can support both money, nominal, and units, and any specified currency. So the BDT now supports offerings in units and more complex offerings where nominal currency and payment currency or fee currency or redemptions may be in different currencies. So it's a more complicated structure that especially where you have series that are offered in different currencies. Issuance types now cover programs, standalone, global notes, TAPS, series, tranches, and classes. The private placement section has been expanded. The private placement section has been expanded. So private placement, in terms of its definition, can vary by jurisdiction. So now there is provisions in here to indicate which jurisdiction a private placement may be applicable to. There also was an expansion of the swap weight pricing structure. So now it's a term structure instead of a single swap price. So this you can create term structures of 2, 5, 10 years if you need to. The DLT section also expanded. As we mentioned, there were a number of new DLT offerings using the BDT. So with that, we expanded, especially this area down around the smart contract that now lets you define multiple tokens per offering, depending on what the actual role of the token is and what the role of the smart contract is. So you can have multiple smart contracts here. This would specifically be used depending on what the role is that the platform is playing, but also includes the technical reference and the smart contract address. There was another, just to touch upon a couple of others, selling restrictions was expanded. It is now an inclusive list of options and enumeration codes. So this will eliminate a lot of ambiguity that could be occurring with free text fields. And the other big expansion was on redemptions. So redemptions has been expanded considerably to support more complex payouts. So optional payouts, fixings, payouts of securities versus cash, and payouts in different currencies. Just now moving down to the product section. So kind of that's the issuance part of it. The product is really the part focused on the bond or the security itself. In here, we added more support for complex bonds and payouts, including amortizations and other calculation types, such as averaging on interest rates and so on. And also, just to mention, actually, after a number of discussions with some firms and legal firms and the ICSDs, we modified the form of note structure now into separating legal and physical form. So you can now define the holding form and the registration form separately, such as dematerialized versus bearer, and so on. So that was something that helped us really align with all the different terminologies and variations in the market. We also support now zero coupon and perpetual bonds, and the product interest rate structure here. I can find it here. The product interest rate structure has been expanded to support much more complex types of floating rate, especially. So variable rates using different forms of benchmark and different underlying rates and different structured payouts. So if you have payouts that may change from fixed rate to floating rate, those are included as well. So here's the interest rate payout section, considerable expansion on the floating rate, as I mentioned here, with more variables such as calculation provisions, fallback provisions, and so on. And then just moving down, you also, to support, probably this occurs more in some emerging market offerings where there are linked products, such as a bond offering that may have a linked swap to it. You can now include a separate extendable XSD that would define what that underlying or what that linked product may be. as well as underlying products. So you can now support a bond that may be supported, or its payouts or interest rates are based on a set of underlying uh, other securities. And lastly, just taking a look, is the series tranche class structure. So you can now define a tranche, let's say, an example, it would be a tranche of a series or multiple tranches of a single series, or you can have a series based on a tranche. So you actually let you combine these together in various ways. You'll include series identifier, the amounts, but you can expand and create an entire new issuance off of, let's say, a series where there are different selling restrictions. Let's say Reg S versus 144, those would be completely different new securities. They may be under the same series or they may be under the similar tranche. So that lets you expand and create a much more complex offerings. And just to highlight a couple of the examples here, just a basic example here of a new tranche on an existing series. So this is fairly compact and not that much data to it. Here's a more complex floating offering. As I mentioned, in the XML format, you'll see the data section up here, the document information section up here. This would then be the definition of the issuance itself. It's a program, and the data that goes into it. And then there is a more complex on the actual offering and the payment. So this is averaging, its method is calculated, and other details of that. As I mentioned, we support this multiple class offering, so you can see the structure of having multiple classes within a single offering. These would be different amounts. They could also be different currencies and maturities and selling restrictions as well. And just one last one example, these are all again in the data pack, is the expansion of the DLT area. So you'll see under the DLT platform, the operator indicated here, and then the smart contract, its address, its purpose being a security token, and a reference to the technical reference of the token itself. And with that, I think we'll go back to the original slides deck, if we could.
Thank you, Tom. Yes, of course.
Excellent. Yeah, so as both Emma and Gabriel mentioned, we partnered with Swift in order to advance the adoption of the BDT. We saw that this adoption was going to be important as part of the ISO 20022. ISO 20022, you know, is now becoming a global messaging standard being used across a broad range of financial markets. So we completed phase one of integrating BDT 1.2 into ISO. We're now working with Swift on version 2 into ISO, as well as constructing the ISO messages, which will include pre-issuance, assignment and announcements, and other parts of the workflow. And that is work that's ongoing, and it will continue throughout the remainder of this year. Just one other note on the access to the BDT itself. I mentioned that it's available on the website, the ICMA website. We also have made it available on GitHub. GitHub, you know, in the more technical space, is a repository for code, technical standards, and more. It now supports, we now support all the versions, the BDT versions on GitHub. So if you go to the GitHub link, you'll see the latest version is 2.0, but the other versions are also there as well. And GitHub being widely accessible to the those that are most likely in the technology space and that would start to use and adopt the BDT, they will be assured that it's the data, the BDT is stored and it's covered under the proper governance. So that we hope will expand the adoption, giving it access to a much wider audience.
Great. Thank you, Tom.
Thank you.
So with that, we will move on to the Q&A section for the last minutes of this webinar. We will start with the first question we've received, which I will address to Gabriel. And that is how the BDT coexists with other standards. We've touched on ISO 2022, but also, for example, the FINOS common domain model. So, Gabriel, over to you on that one.
Yes, sure. And I think it's important to consider the different genesis of the common domain model on the one hand and the BDT. The FINOS common domain model is something that ICMA has or continues to support and collaborate together with ISDA and ISLA on. And it was initially designed for more complex products, in particular for derivatives, repos, and securities lending transactions, to essentially represent in digital form the entire life cycle event, also provide code to then automate those life cycle events. And it is today predominantly used for swaps reporting as part of the ISDA digital regulatory reporting solution. There are also other implementations underway by some larger banks to implement the CDM as well for repo trading, pre-trade processes, post-trade, etc. Whereas the BDT, as we heard in today's webinar, was initially designed with a focus on bond issuance processes and then expanding as well to encompass DLT-based securities. So slightly different focus. And while the CDM doesn't cover bond issuance in particular, the BDT and BDT data could as well be consumed by the CDM through an extension. So there's no possibility. That being said, the focus of the CDM is clearly on those more complex products and covers a wide array of lifecycle events that can be automated, reported, and so on. So they have different focus areas. Tom, is there anything you wanted to add to this?
No, that's absolutely correct. The CDM, has been focused on the transactional part of post issuance, and it supports not just securities that go through an issuance process, but those that are created bilaterally, like derivatives contracts are.
Thank you both. So our next question is on how an institution can know whether they're ready to consume BDT data. So maybe, Tom, I can hand over to you on that one to sort of address the getting started aspect when it comes to the BDT.
Yeah, so as an XML document, you really need only, let's say, a small process that can convert how you actually receive your data. So depending on where you're getting the data source from, converting that into the more structured BDT. So the place to start is probably both who's sending you those documents, who's sending the information to you. Is it coming in a message or are you receiving a PDF? And then where is the issuance document, or where are the issuance stored within your firm, your institution? Do you register it with a back office system? Is it available on the desktop in a structured form? Do people normally just use it in Excel? All of those touch points can basically read the XML once they know what the structure is, which is in the XSD, and give you a standardized format. One way that makes a lot of sense is through web pages, right? So it's very easily converted, this XML, very easily converted into an HTML structure that can be a web page that basically can be used to share within the firm or within the participants of the offering, so your legal firm, your agents, and so on. So that's really the easiest conversion is directly from the BDT structure into HTML structures. And then there's a really fairly small process that's needed to simply take unstructured data and convert it into the BDT format as well. As well as there's been more complex, as was mentioned by the World Bank's project of implementing AI. And as we mentioned, that the best part of that process when you're using AI is that you have a standardized representation. So you have some structured, deterministic way of actually converting the data into a standardized form.
Thanks, Tom. Gabriel, do you have anything to add on that question?
Yes, I think it's important to, I guess, take a step back as well and think about the role of each party in the process, whether you're kind of a receiver of data or if you're the creator of data, and where, for example, as an issuer, you're the creator of data. You can use the BDT from the outset to ensure that there is, as alluded to earlier, and in some of the implementations, a golden source of data that can be distributed along the value chain to different parties in the transaction, ensuring that there is, say, a golden source.
I would maybe just add to that, if I could, that we also have published an annex to the primary market handbook referencing the BDT. So we think a very good part where the market can start to adopt this when they send out PDFs of their issuance documents, they can in parallel send out a BDT, which is a machine readable version of that.
Thank you, Tom and Gabriel. I think with that, we will shortly move on to our conclusion. If there aren't any further questions, I hope they've been addressed. If not, we will get in touch. Actually, we've just had one come in, which we will address quickly. I'll hand to Gabriel on that. And that is also about the relationship between legal documentation and the BDT. So, Gabriel, if I could just hand over to you for a short comment on the interaction between the two concepts, please.
Yes, absolutely. And it's interesting that this question comes up unsurprisingly because it has come up in the past, in particular from a legal perspective, questions around I guess, the relationship between the bond data taxonomy on the one hand and then the legal documentation. And it's very clear, and it's also a point that we have incidentally addressed in the FAQs, that the BDT is not a substitute for the issuance documents that form the legal basis of an offering. And the issuance documents don't need to be amended either to reflect the BDT. So the bottom line really is that the terms of any securities are governed solely by the relevant legal documentation. That being said, it depends as well on the legal frameworks, where in some, depending how a security may be created, if it's in fully dematerialized form, the BDT could also be used to define some of the key characteristics. But these are just individual data elements. Clearly, as we state in the FAQs, the legal documentation supersedes what is represented in the BDT, and it's important to ensure there is, I guess, no discrepancy. That said, it's important to look at the use cases as well. And if you look at the webinar with the World Bank Treasury, it is very interesting to see the approach here where the BDT is used to create a golden source of data, to create a common denominator to describe certain data elements, which may be described differently in the legal documentation, the bond prospectus, to then create a golden source of trade data and share relevant information with participants in the transaction.
Thank you, Gabriel. And whilst we're still with you, I'll hand over to you for some concluding remarks.
Yes, thanks, Emma. And it's great to have received so many questions. I realize we have not been able to answer all of those, but we will consider including those in the set of FAQs in case they're not covered. But indeed, this brings us now to the end of the webinar, but let me wrap up with a few final points. So we heard about the convergence of factors driving digitalization and growing market adoption of the BDT. As pointed out, the BDT is publicly available on the ICMA website, but also on GitHub, and this is kind of newly launched. So as we speak today on the webinar, There are also various resources to support implementation, the user guide, the set of FAQs, webinars on the BDT. And if you do have any questions, then feel free to get in touch. Now, looking ahead, we will be holding our annual FinTech and Digitalization Forum on the 29th of September in London, to which you're cordially invited. It's our flagship event, which brings together over 300 capital market stakeholders. But in the meantime, we'll also hold further webinars, one on the 7th of July on tokenization and DLT market readiness, as well as one in September on BDT implementation and digital assets, and more to follow on this. With this, thank you for joining us today.